Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. So far we've talked about some of the violence of gangs, the power and control, some of the research on the topic and our methods from the study. This is going to shift more towards responding to gangs. And so I want to start, and the reason why I have joining and leaving gangs in this section as responses is because I think there's a real opportunity in prisons to be able to either prevent people from getting involved in gangs altogether, or to intervene in the lives of people who are currently involved. So the question here is, how and why do people get involved in a gang? A group that puts them at risk for victimization, a group that asks them for more loyalty to them than their family, a group that prolongs their stays in prison, that increases their risk for recidivism. And by the same token, how and why do people get out of them? This is also a group that's believed to provide them with safety, that provides them with brotherhood and companionship, economic opportunities, and so on. And so this is what I'm going to address in this section right here. So there are a lot of questions about whether the origins of gang membership are found inside of prison or outside of prison. In other words, do people join gangs on the street or do they join gangs in the prison system? This is an important question. And the reason why is that our solutions to gangs will either be found on the inside or the outside for preventing them or for intervening in the lives of these individuals. But we don't know a lot about this. So we had 802 people in the study. 2 of our guys refused to answer the gang question. We can't force them to answer the question, so we just couldn't include them in this chart right here. One of them, we couldn't figure out whether he joined the gang on the street or if he first joined the gang in prison. But we could pinpoint it for the other 799. Now there's 2 things I want to point out here. One is where you see these N's right here. This represents the frequency, how many times we observed it. When you see the percentages, that represents the percent, and those are weighted. And what weighting means is we just correct for the fact that gang members are overrepresented in the study. To be able to say, out of everybody who went into prison, what percent of them were gang members when they walked in? And then by the same token, out of everybody who left prison, what percent of them were gang involved when they left? So we could make that an inference to the general population. So 18% of these guys indicated to us that they had a gang affiliation, and that gang affiliation started on the street. And about 1/3 of them, they left their affiliation on the street before they went to prison, and the other 2/3 brought it in with them. So that's one of the interesting findings. Another one has to do with the fact that about 12% of our guys, or 209 altogether, joined a gang for the first time in their life when they went to prison. Now, we typically think about gang membership as starting around age 13 or 14. That's the modal age. In representative studies in the United States, that's when kids say they first join gangs. This is a whole different group we're talking about. This is a group of people who initiate their involvement for the first time in their life while they're incarcerated. Time's up. Sorry. All right, so the other thing to point out here is that among people who are gang members in prison, look, if you just focus on the population of people who are gang members who say they're active, are 346 individuals. Most of them, their gang membership originated in prison as opposed to on the street. So there's some speculation here about, if you look at all the gang members in those 213,000 guys who are gang members in prison, what we're finding is that slightly more of them started in prison than on the street. That's a pretty notable finding that we thought, because it's an indication that prison could function, that you could prevent gang membership altogether by using strategies to stop these guys, whatever those strategies are. I don't know what they are, but to stop them from getting affiliated with gangs for the first time. And the problem is that if they start it in prison, they're likely to carry it back out on the street, or at least that's what's been led to believe. So here's our guys all together. We have 70% of our sample. This is representative of at least a sample who's getting ready to be released from prison, who have never been affiliated with a gang in their lifetime. We have 10% of them who imported it from the street, and then 12% of them whose prison gang membership, or whose gang membership originated in prison. So the next question then is, how and why, or why and how do they join? We know a lot about the motivations for gang membership among street gangs. mostly among teenagers. That's what we've asked. That's where we have most of our knowledge. Why do people join gangs in prison? And how different or similar are the motivations for joining gangs in prison to the way that people are motivated to join gangs on the street? We asked these questions open-ended. We said, why'd you join a gang, essentially? And they gave us, in some cases, it was a very clear response, I joined for protection, or it was a long-winded response, and it captured a whole range of different things that were happening in their life. But about half of our guys, as we said, joined on the street, the other half joined in prison. So it gives us a sense to be able to compare them to see how similar or different the two are. Okay, I need to move this. There we go. So these are open-ended questions, and so the most common response was what's called normative influence. It's my neighborhood, it's my family, that's why I joined. It's who I was. These are normative influences from where they're from, that they just became it because of family or friends or neighborhood. The second most common was belonging. They saw the gang as a source of companionship, a source of loyalty, trust, a sense of family, friendship. That was the motivation for them getting involved. Instead of it being normal, they saw the pulls into the gang as opposed to the pushes. Normative influences are pushes. They propel them towards the group. The pulls are something that yank them, that attract them to the group. So those two were similar in terms of the rank order. Those are the most common in both settings. But notice the differences in the proportions. That was the most common response is normative influence on the street. 50% of the guys said that. In prison, it was only 30% of the guys. And who's driving that? It was the tongos. The guys who said, I want to affiliate with my hometown group when I'm incarcerated. The next most common, then it becomes more of a mixed bag here. Things start shuffling. In the prison system, people didn't join for economic reasons. It was rare. It was the least endorsed response. On the street, it was far more common. And by far more, I'm talking about 5 percentage point differences. It was the third most common on the street, the least most commonly endorsed in prison. The one that was really noticeable to us, or notable to us, was that when people join gangs in prison, the third and fourth most common reasons have to do, for one, with ideology, which is something that is almost never mentioned among street settings. And when we're talking about ideology, what we're referring to is they share a belief system in the gang. That it could be something related to religion. We saw that noted with the Mexican Mafia. It could be something with race supremacy. We saw that noted sometimes with the white gangs. We would also see ideology noted just saying that I share a common set of values and beliefs in this group and I want to affiliate with them. Ideology was also common among the tongos. And the reason why is they saw tongos, that stands for, at least what our guys said, together against negative gang organizations. And the tongos viewed themselves as protective towards their fellow Latino men against these predatory family groups that they saw. So they found that the ideology was something that was consistent with their interests. Protection was more common in prison, as you might suspect. About a fifth of these guys said, I joined it for protection, as opposed to on the street where only 4% said that. But the one that was really interesting to us, status was just about similar between the two settings. And so we see a mixture of pushes and pulls. So it's not just pushes that push them into the group, but it's also pulls that pull them into the group. They find these groups to be attractive. They serve a function in their life. They serve a purpose for helping these individuals. Now, it's one thing to be motivated to join a group, because we all share motivations to do things. But motives aren't methods. So how do they get involved in the group? How do they transition? What steps do they have to take to transition from being just a regular inmate in general population to being somebody who assumes an identity of a gang member? So in terms of rank order, there's stability between street and prison settings. But there are some slight variations that are worth pointing out here. So we think of joining a gang as passive entry versus active entry. Passive is essentially you walk right in. You don't really have to do much to get in. Active entry means that you had to engage in some sort of activity or some sort of observation period before you're considered to be a member. So jumping in was the most common in both settings. You have to go through it, whether it was 1 minute, 3 minutes, we heard, 24 variants of how long they had to get jumped, and multiple variants of by how many people had to jump them. So it depended on the group. Like if you were the Hoover Crips, it was like 52 Hoover Crips. It had to do with like 5 people for 2 minutes or something like that. If you were with other groups, you had to roll dice, something along those lines. But you had to go through some sort of ceremonial experience, whether it was drawn out or whether it was quickly. You had to go through something to become a full-fledged member. Now, there were some differences, and the jumping in prison had a lot to do with the tongos. They'd have to get jumped in. And there was some indication that when they got transferred from facility to facility, there was also jumping in that occurred when they went from one facility to another. So I don't know if that's consistent with the reality, but that was something that did come up and was mentioned. Prospecting was more common in prison than it was on the street. And when we're talking about prospecting, we're talking about the STGs. Particularly, we're talking about the Texas Syndicate, Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Aryan Circle. That they have to go through a period of observation where they're taken under the wing of a more senior member who teaches them the rules, the Constitution, and so on of the group. It's sort of it would be along the lines of what you see in the military, along the lines of what you see with post standards in law enforcement for moving into it. I'm not trying to make a one-to-one comparison here, but just to say that there are some similarities for getting involved in these groups, and it's prolonged over a period of time. Other forms of violence, whether it was within their own gang or to other gangs, was common. Those who said they had to do nothing, usually it was because they had some sort of, or I guess the gang ties, it was some sort of family connection. They had a family connection or it was a neighborhood connection, and so they didn't have to do anything to get involved. There was no jumping in. They were sort of just blessed to walk right into the group. But again, it wasn't as common as we've seen in other studies, especially with teenagers. And then attacking rivals. What was interesting was that there was a lot of mixes. So like you would see mixed opinions about getting involved in some of these STGs, where some people would say, I got into the Mexican Mafia, but I didn't have to do anything. Where others say, I had to prospect to get involved. There was consistency with the Aryan Brotherhood. I mean, it was almost across the board. They were all saying, I had to attack a black inmate. I had to inflict pain on a black inmate to be able to get inside this group. So that was one of the noticeable things, is seeing some consistency with some groups and then less consistency with other groups. So this is about the motives and methods. We also asked, and I don't have anything here about it, about how people avoid gangs and steps that they take to either actively or passively say to stop their involvement. And we saw a fair amount of them, just like Nancy Reagan, just say no. And that worked on the street better than it worked in prison. Like when they say that they had to say no in prison, it was constantly saying no. And some of them would say, and you don't usually think of homosexuality as an asset in prison, but for some of them who were homosexual, they said, oh, I just told them I was gay so I wouldn't have to get involved in the group, because they wouldn't allow homosexuals in the group. So that came up a few different times. Those who were sex offenders, that was a big one, who were involved in child abuse. They used that as a way to say that I could avoid getting involved in these groups when they were approached about it. So we have a fair amount of the book devoted to that discussion as well. So let's talk about leaving. There's a lot of arrows on this chart, and let me walk through this slowly here. So it's long been believed that gang membership is a lifelong commitment. It's written into the constitutions of some of these groups, that when you get involved in these groups, that you're not allowed to leave them. And if you do leave them, you have to spill blood to leave. Now, that view has been completely debunked on the street. We know that on the street, the vast majority of people who join gangs also leave gangs, and they leave it quicker than we were ever led to believe. It's only a couple of years that most teenagers are involved in it. The problematic groups is the ones who get involved and then stay involved for a sustained. When they cross over from 17 to 18 to 19 years old and they're still involved, that's usually the more problematic group. Those who are just teenagers and drop out, they're the less problematic group. So in this figure, what I have here is, does this view of a lifelong commitment of gang membership, does it apply to the prison? Can people leave gangs in prison? Is it even possible? And if it is, how do they do it and why do they do it? And let me start by saying it happens a lot, and it happens a lot more than we would have ever imagined. And let me walk through this because I've spent a lot of years focusing on how people get out of gangs, the steps that they have to take and their motivations for doing it. But let me walk through this slide first. So the black lines represent the 70% on the upper, the 70% of the people who had never been involved in a gang. The red lines represent those who claim to still be active in a gang. And we find that when they're at our post-release interview, 11%, again, these are the weighted numbers, 11% are exiting prison with an active gang affiliation. Self-reported. This is not what the prison system says about them. The blue and green lines represent those who are no longer active. They've de-identified as a gang member. Whether or not that information is known to everybody, at least in their head, they're telling us that they've de-identified. And we put a lot of value in that because there tends to be some good validity in telling us that they've de-identified as a gang member. 19% of these inmates are former gang members when they're getting ready to leave prison. So the important point here is that people leave gangs while they're active in prison, and it happens far more frequently than they like, because you could see the street exit versus the prison exits there. And what we see here is that most inmates leave gangs, more inmates leave gangs than join gangs while they're in prison. So that's one notable finding. 63% of those who join a gang in prison also leave a gang. 50% of those who imported their gang membership into prison also left their gang in prison. Again, at least they've de-identified as a gang member. So these are some pretty notable findings. At least they're de-identifying as gang members at a far more frequent rate than we would have ever guessed. We didn't think we were going to get numbers like this, but we are. Could this have to do with being a pre-release interview? Absolutely. Several of the Tongo guys said, oh, I'm a gang member right now, but the second I step out on that street, the second I walk through those doors right there, I'm done. That's it. I was only a member because I was in prison. So we also look into that too in a couple of slides. So why do they leave? To what extent does it differ from the street? And these were also open-ended questions, and we put them into these 8 categories. Disillusionment was the most common. It's the most common on the street. It's the most common in prison. It's the most common across every single study we've ever looked at. And what we're talking about with disillusionment is this could be maturational reform. They get older. The gang lifestyle is no longer consistent with their interests. It could be there was a shift in gang politics that made them disillusioned with the group. It could be the realization that the gang sold them a bill of goods. They promise protection, yet I've got all these stab wounds. They promise economic opportunities. I've got nothing to show for my life. They promise companionship, and yet these guys are snitching on me. And so that realization is what, to use academic language, we call this the crystallization of discontent. When they realize that they no longer want to be involved in that group, that's when that's when we see disillusionment really taking place, and they're starting to step away from the gang. That is a push. That pushes them, propels them out of the group. Pushes are the most common reason why people leave. They get tired of the group. There's also pulls. The pulls happen outside of the gang. These are the things that encourage them to want to leave, and usually it's family. So a lot of these guys, as you might imagine, family is just as common on the street as it is in prison. It just takes on a different flavor in prison. On the street, you're seeing the birth of your child, you're seeing your spouse, your girlfriend, your other girlfriend pulling you in a certain direction. I guess I said that, yeah. In prison, it's the realization that you have a sense of responsibility to your family and you're not holding up your responsibility. It's the realization that you're not spending time and you're missing those birthdays. It's a sadness. I mean, we don't really think about gang members that way in terms of sadness, but it does exist. The sadness that you're missing out on the experiences of your children. And for some of them, it didn't work for their children, but it worked for their grandchildren, seeing their grandchildren not being raised. So that was a big one. There's also triggering events that are common, and triggering events are usually victimization experiences. When they realize that they're ending up in a hospital and that nobody is there to show for them, when they got incarcerated and nobody's putting money on their books, that's when it triggers it for them. Or someone in their family member got injured and the gang wasn't doing anything for them. The triggering events that encourage them to leave. Some of what you start to see differences is with criminal justice system involvement. In prison, it loomed a little bit larger, or a lot larger. A lot of it had to do with the STGs and solitary confinement. They realized that I got here because of the gang. I'm not going to get parole when I wanted to because of the gang. And I'm going to have to, have some debt to this group for a longer period of time because of the gang. So it's some of the pressures that come from law enforcement and from the DOC. There is also one of the other differences is in religion. A lot of them find God, find Allah, and so on while they're in prison. That was far more common than it was on the street, by far more. We're talking about 10% versus 2%. But religion, like in Brazilian prisons, for example, religion's the only way to get out of these groups, what we see over there, because it's realized as like a viable pathway to get out. The gangs respect it. They respect religion. They say, if you're turning to be a man of God, we respect it. Go on your way. You can do that. And it's a way out. It's a viable pathway out of the group. So it's viewed as being a strong motivation for leaving these gangs. How do they get out? We see some pretty big differences here for leaving prison on the street versus leaving in or leaving gangs in prison versus leaving gangs on the street. Also passive versus active. The passive ways, you're walking out and doing nothing. There's nothing associated with leaving. Active ways is there has to be some sort of communicative or interactional, some exchange is occurring between the person who intends to leave and the gang. So in prison, giving notice was the most commonly endorsed item. This is something we never really saw in street gang studies that focused more on teenagers. And what giving notice means is you're notifying the gang of your intentions. You're indicating to them, and some of this is, can I get permission to leave? Other parts of this is, I'm just giving you guys a heads up because I respect you that I'm leaving. So, and this differed slightly between the STGs and the prison-oriented groups, that there was more of a requesting to leave on the STGs, whereas on the prison-oriented groups, it was more just letting them know I'm moving in other directions. Nothing was less common in prison versus on the street. On the street, that was the normal way of getting out. You just move on. You don't do anything associated with getting out of these groups. Jumping out did occur. It was usually with the Tongos where jumping out occurred, although it happened a fair amount with the black gangs as well. Stopping associations, it was easier to do on the street than it was in prison. Again, in prison you're confined. These are institutions that control what you eat, with whom you live, the programs you get, and so on. There's eyes on you. So it's just easier to get out on the street because you can go and move from El Paso to Austin if you needed to, and to try to knife off those ties. So these were the motivations that we observed. And in general, we found that it's just harder to leave gangs in prison than it is on the street, because that these are institutions that have a lot of control over individuals. The last thing to mention is interventions. Only 2% of the people who left gangs on the street noted an intervention, whereas in prisons, 12% of them. What's that intervention? It's the gang renouncement and disassociation program. That's what we're referring to here. That's the only true intervention that really takes place in the prison system to facilitate exit from gangs. Now, I'm going to talk about the grad program. That's what that is in a second. But what I want to note, one last point here, is that the ways in which people get out of these groups, it starts with sort of this cognitive transformation. In their head, they realize that they're leaving. How they go about sharing that information with others is important. If they just say that in your head you're a former gang member, nobody treats you like a former gang member, because you have to share your intentions. You have to tell people that you're leaving. And post-exit validation is a critical part of this process. You have to validate. They need to take steps to validate that, and I'm not talking about like classification. I'm talking about validating it in the eyes of other people. So when you ask gang members what you're worried about when you get out of the gang, they're not going to say rival gangs. They don't say their own gang. They don't say their family or their neighborhood. They're worried about the police. They're worried about constantly being listed, coming up in a gang database, and the possibility of them getting reclassified as a gang member. That's what they're truly worried about. That's what they indicate. They're not fearful of the rivals. So the problem is that the police are usually the last to know that someone's left a gang, unless this is through like a one-on-one intense interview or interrogation that's going on. And rightly so in some ways. Talk is cheap on the street. So how do you read between the signs to determine whether or not somebody's truly a former gang member? We look at post-exit validation. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at signals that they're sending out, costly signals that could potentially hurt them by showing disrespect to their group and so on. So there's methods to help communicate their status to people outside of the group. and they have to take costly steps. One of those costly steps would be like burning bridges to the group, going through a program like grad, going through debriefing procedures. That's a burning a bridge. There's also building bridges outside of the gang, to their family, to employment, and so on, things that show a disconnect between the lifestyle that they're living and then the lifestyle of the gang. That's building a bridge. But these are also these credible commitments that these guys are making to a non-gang lifestyle. It takes time. It's usually drawn out over a period of time. It's rarely knifing off. It's usually more prolonged. But you're looking for things that lead them to disconnect their lifestyle in the gang to the lifestyle out of the gang, looking for sharp disconnects. One of those signals, we think, is the gang renouncement and disassociation program in the prison system. So I'm going to share with you some preliminary findings from this. I call this preliminary because it's not a formal evaluation. But there's only 4 programs in the 51 prison systems across the U.S. that aim to facilitate exit from gangs throughout the country. The rest of them are debriefing. Debriefing is not a program. Debriefing is sharing information about the gang, and it could result in the death of some of these guys. This is different. This is a program that's modeled after the Connecticut Department of Corrections and was translated to Texas to be unique to Texas culture, unique to Texas gangs, and so on. It's been in place since 2000. There's never been an evaluation of it. It's focused specifically on the 7 gangs that are placed in segregation, as well as the Texas Mafia that's no longer placed in segregation, but there's a number of these guys in our study. The Texas prison system also has a related study called ASD. This is Ad-Seg Diversion. It tries to get them on the way in. So the grad program focuses on them throughout their incarceration. Ad-Seg Diversion tries to get them on the way in. That was developed more recently. We don't have an evaluation of that here. This is what grad looks like. And I know there's a lot of words on this slide, but let me just highlight the things that I think are probably the most important to you. It takes them 2 years to go through this process. It starts with an investigation phase. They stay in AdSeg for 12 months, and what the STG management office does is it investigates their continued ties to the gang. If they don't find any ties to the gang, whether it's through mailings, whether it's through communications of any sort, they advance to the next stage. So when they're at the disassociation investigation phase, it's just like AdSeg. It's just another 12 months in it. I shouldn't say just. It's another 12 months in it. When they move to the normalization phase, phase 1, the difference here is that, for one, it's a 2-month period. It's at one of these 2 units. They start to have contact with other people. So remember, a lot of these guys haven't gone through having a handshake with another person, let alone a hug, beyond any human contact beyond getting cuffs put on you. And so they have more privileges. They're still limited, but more in and out of cell movement. And they can get a visit. And that's one of the biggest things. They can start to get visits from their family members. And that's a huge incentive for people to want to enter into the program. And they get programming. Substance abuse, domestic violence programming, and then counselor meetings, whether those are piped in or whether they're into their cell or whether they're one-on-one, I can't recall. But either way, the purpose here is to normalize these guys who have spent years in AdSeg. The next, they move into a socialization phase. And what's really notable here, not only it's 4 months, but there's double celled now. And this is the first time in a while. So think about everything I've been talking about with getting out of gangs and put that in relation to what this program or this practice is doing. And they're double celled with a historical rival. It could be a different ethnicity. So these are only applied to white inmates and Latino inmates because, at least when we were doing data collection, because none of the black inmates were automatically placed in AdSeg. They start to get different clothing. Again, you're starting to replace some of the group characteristics of gangs with the characteristics of this program. So, thinking about what gangs provide them, you're replacing those things with some other cohesiveness. Again, the companionship that gangs could provide. More programming, more movement, more in and out of cell privileges, and then more intervention services. Classroom programming, they have group programming, they do journaling and writing about their past experiences and so on, substance abuse treatment, and then anger management, role-playing group activities. So they go from AdSeg, where there's none of this available, no visitations, to a place where they get more visitations, more out-of-cell privileges, and so on. And then 3 months, at 3 months, they move into essentially general population. more regular visitation, just like what any other inmate would get, phone calls, commissary, and so on, and then access to work opportunities. So, how'd these guys do? Let's first say who's in it. So, out of the 368 people in our study who the Texas prison system classified as a member of an STG, 53 of them went through the grad program. Well, they all didn't complete it. I think 50 of these 53 completed it. The other 3 failed out for one reason or another. But this is called intent to treat. Anybody who they had an intention to treat, they were included in this group. And then we compared it to 64 guys who were from the eligible gangs but didn't go through the grad program. And tried to match them up as best as we could in terms of their demographics, in terms of their criminal history, and so on. And look, we did a pretty good job, I think. There's not much of a difference between the 53 and the 64 guys. They're all represented, both groups are represented in all of the 8 gangs that were eligible for the grad program. And we see demographically they're very similar. The only difference is the grad guys are a couple of years older, which could be pretty impactful. So again, it's a good cross-section that we have here. And now let's see how they did. So these are Tdcj reports on your right-hand side and survey reports on your left-hand side of gang status. And the red group represents everybody who didn't go through grad. The blue group represents those who did go through it. And in terms of claiming being an active gang member, we see only 3% of the people, essentially 1 or 2 people in the grad group, claim that they're still active, whereas 21% of those claim current gang membership in the non-grad group. Almost all of them claim former gang membership in the grad group. 73% of them claim former gang membership in the non-grad group. So again, there are differences. These differences are meaningful. They might not be as large as we would expect them to be, partly because a lot of the people who didn't go through grad already claim that they're no longer gang members in the first place. Now, when we look at Tdcj records, we also see differences in current gang membership and former gang membership. Notice, though, for current gang membership, 56% of the non-grad group claims that that Tdcj claims that they're current gang members, whereas 21% only told us. So there is clearly a discrepancy, and we think a lot of that's brought about by placement in ADSEG. Okay, those are gang status, whether or not they claim it. That's a pretty black and white measure. Let's look at more of their connection to the gang. This is what's called embeddedness. I mentioned it earlier, but this refers to their individual immersion within the gang. How deeply immersed are they? And the problem with relying just on gang status is it's all black and white. There's no shades of gray. This tries to capture some of the shades of gray in their level of embeddedness. So this focuses on things like attachment to the gang, their commitment to the gang, how involved they are, and how much they're in line with the belief system of the group. And what you could see here, if you focus on that yellow highlighted area, these are what's called standardized scores. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but just to say that it's standardized, so it's a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, just so we could make a comparison. How big of a difference is there? Overall, the grad group, there's about what, in scientific terms, it's a 0.6 difference. That's like a pretty big effect size. People would look at that like if we showed this to a group of academics, or maybe Leanne or Mario might want to say otherwise, but if we showed this to a group of academics, they would say that's a pretty big difference between the two when you take into account all these other background factors. What's driving it? They claim to have a lower position in the gang. They find the gang to be less important to their life. They have less influence on gang activities than they did before. They have less contact with the gang. They have fewer friends who are gang members. Overall, these are pretty positive signs. This is what you would expect to find. Again, these are based on self-reports, but there's a pretty good amount of validity behind these measures of embeddedness in gangs. Now, if it's just gang status alone, now this might be a controversial statement here, but there's nothing inherently criminal about being a gang member. It's the group that influences their behavior. Whether or not they claim gang status, like the oldest guy in our study, I think he was about 70 years old, and he was still claiming gang status. Gang member. Is that guy involved in a lot of criminal behavior? Absolutely not. He doesn't have much influence on the gang anymore. He's got great-grandchildren. He's older. He's not someone that you really have to worry about. Although there's plenty of 67-year-old gang members who you probably have to worry about. But the point is to say that just because somebody claims to be a gang member, it doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to be involved in criminal behavior. And there's plenty of research to support that point. But did grad also correspond with changes in misconduct and victimization? Well, we didn't find as positive findings here in this regard. Statistically, no difference in terms of their self-reports of misconduct, no difference in their self-reports of violent misconduct or victimization, no difference in official records of misconduct, and really across the board there were no difference in property-based misconduct, selling drugs misconduct, and so on in the prison system. Now, this is a small sample. We only have just over 100 people in this. This was sort of a post hoc construction of this evaluation because there's only 4 of these programs in the United States. Let's see if there's any inkling of evidence to suggest that they might be useful and might be an opportunity to intervene in the lives of some of these guys. And the last thing to mention, this is in the last 6 months before they were released. So we don't know when they entered grad, when they exited grad. We're just trying to do the best comparison possible. So we think that there is some positive evidence behind this, but clearly this is not definitive evidence. It needs a formal evaluation of this before we reach any sort of hard conclusions. All right. So this book is competing for control. We think gangs compete for control in their power, in their selection of members, in who they allow to leave versus who they don't allow to leave. They compete control in their organizational structure and so on. But this book is really more about the nature and consequences of gangs in prison. It's less so about what happens when they get out in the street. So what I'm going to show here, like we recognize there's a connection between the two, and our study was based strongly on reentry. What I want to show here, these are unpublished findings. They're not in the book, but these are findings that I think this audience might find relevant, is what happens when they get out. What sort of contact do they have in the criminal justice system? They all were released between April and December 2016, and we've got some data on criminal recidivism from DPS for the 2 years that they've been out, and we've got some data from Tdcj on if they got reincarcerated. So these are the rearrest measures. What I have here is this represents on the axis with the percentage points, what percent of them had been arrested. And this shows over time the cumulative proportion, how it increases over time. If they got arrested, they moved into the numerator. The other thing to point out here is the measure of gang membership is based on self-report. It's not based on what Tdcj says, although our numbers are pretty similar. The black dashed line is everybody. And 42% of our guys in their 2 years post-release had gotten rearrested at least once. Those numbers are obviously lower for violent crimes, and it's a mix of property crimes, violent crimes, and public order offenses. But this is about on par with national averages. Over 8 years, about 80% of people get rearrested in their first 8 years post-release. But there's a big difference on this chart, and the difference is gang status. So if we look at those who had never been involved in a gang, that's 70%. Only 32% of them had been arrested in their 2 years post-release. Former gang members, 48%. That's a 16 percentage point difference. Active gang members, it's almost double that of non-gang members. 61% of them had been rearrested. There's not many measures that you could look at where you see a 30 percentage point difference between two different comparison groups. But gang membership is one of them, and it's a strong correlate of recidivism. But this is arrest. We know that gang members tend to live more in urban areas. We know policing practices are different in urban areas than they are in rural areas. So that could be a partial explanation of these activities. So let's look at convictions, whether or not they were actually convicted for a crime. Arrest, that's an important metric, but it's not necessarily a perfect metric. So this focuses on reconviction. We still see some large differences, not as large, but we do see 28% of the non-gang members were reconvicted for a crime, whereas 50% of the gang members were reconvicted. So again, this is another way of telling the story that gang membership is a pretty strong correlate of recidivism. Notice the former gang members are sort of in between. Some of these guys sort of have 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the gang. You know, they get reignited with their gang ties. Something happens on the street to their best friend who's in the gang, well, that might pull them back in. Something happens in the prison, you get some orders to say, look, you've got to do this. That might pull them back in, and that might be explaining some of these, this in-between for the former gang members. So they're not like the active ones, but they're not like those who had never been involved in gangs. We only had 15 months of data for reincarceration. This is a little bit more complicated to reconstruct criminal or prisonization histories. But we do still see differences in reincarceration. We do see more similarities between the former gang members and the non-gang members here. Both were just about 13 to 14% of them were sent back to prison. Part of the reason why incarceration is at the forefront of state governments is because the cost associated with housing these 1.6 million people in these prisons. It's not cheap. And it's 3 times the cost if you're going to put them in solitary confinement. So understanding the consequences of gang membership is important to be able to determine its role in keeping people incarcerated. So we do see some differences. They're not as large. Overall, the active gang members are more likely to get reincarcerated than those who are former gang members and non-gang members. So we do believe that on balance, that this is an important correlate of recidivism, and it's not something that we focus on enough. Now, those who are in probation and parole, I'm sure you guys understand the consequences of gangs. But in the larger conversation about prisoner reentry, gangs are largely nowhere to be found.
One question. Going back to yours, we shouldn't associate the former gang as all being grad.
No, only 53 of the former gang members had gone through grad.
And you mentioned that there hasn't been any evaluation of the grad system since it was implemented in 2012?
Not an external formal. I know there are some internal numbers that look at reclassification with a gang, and those numbers are, I don't want to mince my words here, but they are so low that if it is true, this should be a nationwide program. Now, however, that was internal numbers from Tdcj that they're putting out.
You mentioned there's 4 other states, one of which was Connecticut. Has any of those states done an evaluation?
Nope. Connecticut hasn't, what is the other one? California, it's a pseudo-gang intervention. It's a step-down program that was introduced after the Ashker class action lawsuit. So those haven't been evaluated. I was invited to do an evaluation in California with some of my colleagues. We got the project started, and then we lost our access for a reason that's undetermined at this point in time to do the evaluation. So there should be, we should be focusing on it this is a big issue. This is not, gangs in prison are not just a Texas issue. It's not just a California or Illinois issue. It's across the board. They're just, I think, worse in Texas and California than they are in some of the other states. So gang recidivism. What happens to these guys when they get out? And I was scrambling to put these numbers together this last week just to give you guys a sense of what happens in their gang status. What are they reporting when they transition from the prison to the street? Remember, we re-interviewed these guys about 30 days post-release and about 10 months post-release. And we asked them about their gang affiliations. And this is, we have a lot more measures that we are going to investigate, but this is at least they're self-reported. Are they current? Are they former? And so on. So there's 3 groups in our study. We have the 70% who had never been in a gang. We were able to interview 80% of them, 79% of them when they returned back to the street. We had 300 former gang members in this study. We were able to interview another 75% of these guys. So you can see here there's 300. We interviewed 236 of them. For the active gang members, there was 140 of them. We re-interviewed 103 of them when they returned to the street. Active gang members, we interviewed 74% of them who were interviewed at the pre-release time. So what happened to their gang status? So those who had never been in a gang, 2 of them indicated to us that they had joined a gang post-release. Essentially, at any point in time, think about it as like 1 year post-release. And then out of those 2 people, 1 of them also left. So it's not like when you get out of prison. Remember, these are 40-year-olds generally. So they're not really joining a lot of gangs when they get out in the street. For the former gang members, 4 of them said they joined a gang. They rejoined a gang when they got out of prison, and 1 of them left. So there's not a lot of reactivation of these gang ties post-release. Again, they're worried about families, where they're going to live and reuniting with, or where to work and so on. Gangs are not always necessarily on the forefront of their concerns. For the active gang members, this was a little bit more complicated, where we see that out of those 103, about half of them stayed involved in their group, and about half of them left. And for those who left, they also said that they dropped out of the gang that they're involved in prison, and then they got involved in a different gang on the street. So there is some continuity that's going on here, But if we were to look at this, you go from an active population of 11% to first year post-release, at least an active identified population of about 5 to 6% post-release. So it looks like the gang ties are waning as opposed to increasing. This is all I was able to do. There's a lot of questions that we still have about this, and we're going to formally evaluate this or dig into this in more detail in the future. But we do think it's interesting. This is an older population. Usually you associate gang activity with people in their late teens and their 20 years, at least those who have come to the attention of law enforcement. You don't necessarily think about them as post-release. However, most people in this room will understand that when some of the OGs get out, the veteranos get out of prison, they ignite problems on the street. They come to assume the status that they had previously, and this could shake up the gang landscape in a significant way. And that's something that we want to look into in more detail in this study. Okay. How are we doing on time? I'm going to run through this quicker. Think how are we doing on time? Okay. I'll try to go through these just in about 5, 6, 7 minutes. Because I just want to give some takeaway points. This is not a book about policy. It's not a book about practice. But it does have findings that have implications for policy and practice. So I'll just give you a brief overview of some of these implications that I think might be relevant here. Some of this has to do, I know the term mass incarceration can be a controversial term, but let's just assume that mass incarceration is something that does represent the boom in the prison population. Again, if we're incarcerating people at a rate of about 150 per 100,000 in the early 1970s, and now we're incarcerating people at a rate of about 700 per 100,000 in the United States, it's just happening a lot more. The sources of that are still disputed, but what we need to recognize is that the rise of prison population corresponded with the rise of gangs. Some people say that this had direct implications. In other words, prisons became more violent, there was less governance in prisons, and that is what led to the formation of gangs. You had more violent offenders, more racially diverse offenders, and people moved in essentially into their own tribes and started to come into conflict with one another. What this means, though, to us is that the strategies to solve gangs don't necessarily have to be in prison. You could also find the strategies to solve prison gang activity on the street. So anything that occurs on the street to reduce the influence of gangs could pay dual dividends by not only reducing the problems on the street, but also reducing the issues of the cycling of gang members in and out of prison and reduce the violence in prisons as well. So that's one of the implications, I think, that stem pretty closely from what we observed about the emergence of gangs in prisons. The others have to do with gang-oriented programming. Put simply, I think we could say with pretty convincing evidence, at least in Texas, the gang members are just simply different from the non-gang members. They have a different set of risk factors. Now, typically in prison, you take whatever exists and assume, in terms of the programming, and assume that it's one size fits all. That whatever works for all inmates, it should work just as well for gang inmates. And that's not the case. It's not the case on the street, where we see our best practices programs. You try to apply them to gang members, and they just don't work as well. Multi-systemic therapy, for example, applied to gang members, and it didn't work like it did for the non-gang population. So we think that at least what our risk factors findings are showing is that gang members have a unique set of risks and needs, and those need to be responded to differently. And so there's this argument in the research about social deficiencies. And you could see that with their attitudes and their beliefs. And that you have to address some of these social deficiencies to be able to get recidivism rates that are on par with the non-gang members. You have to be able to respond to them. So it's not just plug and play. It's devising unique solutions that is not just suppression, but also prevention and intervention solutions. So gang members are overrepresented in our study as victims and offenders. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We think it doesn't have to do with the fact that these are individual characteristics. We have to think it has to do with the group. It's the group that's influencing their behavior. It's not like some risk propensity that they have. So there's possibilities for group intervention. We've seen some merit behind group interventions on the street. Focused deterrent strategies, now known as group violence intervention. Cure violence strategies. We see that there's a lot of merit behind those strategies on the street. Could something like this work for prisons? I don't know. But the fact that these group processes are what we think is what's leading these gang members to engage in more criminal behavior and misconduct behind bars, it would suggest that these might be possible solutions to respond to gangs in prison. So the grip of the gang is what we're talking about. It's the ability to make people do things, to have power over people that they wouldn't normally do as an individual. And so gangs maintain power in prisons, but we don't think it's that iron-fisted power that we've been led to believe. So what we think of is that when the grip is weaker on people, that those are opportunities to sweep in and do interventions. So this could occur when gangs are fracturing, when there is some sort of multi-jurisdictional task force that comes in with the stick. We better be prepared to also come in with the carrot as well, to encourage them to get out of the group. That's for individuals. But when individuals are subject to victimization, so for example, like there's this program in London called Red Thread, that they wait until somebody gets victimized. And then when they're in the hospital, then they just swarm them with services. In other words, you don't want the gang to come in and provide them with their needs. You want some other groups to be able to come in and provide them and meet their needs. So we think that victimization can function as an opportunity to intervene when that grip is weakened, especially if the violence is attributed to the gang, especially intra-gang violence. So prison as a turning point, this is what gives us a lot of optimism. Prison can be, we usually think of prison as a bad thing, but we can also think about prison as a good thing. And it could be an opportunity to prevent people from getting involved in gangs in the first time in their life. It could be an opportunity to intervene in these guys, when, especially the street gang members who are isolated from their street-based activities. So the grad program is one way to do this, but again, grad is connected to solitary confinement. I'm not sure everybody wants to hang their hat on solitary confinement practices. And then the ADSEG diversion program is another opportunity when it comes to prevention and intervention. The question about housing, we didn't look at. There's a lot of people who have questions about how do you put them, how do you house these guys in prisons? So there's really two different theories. One is you disperse them across the prison, and this is based more on public health. You send them across the prison so that they can't concentrate in a certain area to influence other inmates, encouraging them to join gangs. Another theory is that you concentrate them. You put them all together in a pod, and they could do whatever their cohesiveness is as their group, but they can't influence other people. They can't infect the general population, if you will. And then there is another perspective about isolation, about solitary confinement. But again, solitary confinement is especially expensive. But what I should note here is that while most of the inmates universally despise solitary confinement because it isolated them physically, socially, and so on, and they viewed it as being damaging to them, some of them also viewed it as a vacation. They called it a reprieve from the general population, from the risks that come from the general population. And so this is not an advocation for it, but it's a recognition that if somebody is in that confinement, this should be an opportunity to be intervening in their lifestyles. And so there's only so many beds that are available in solitary confinement, but it should be an opportunity for trying to institute turning points. We see a lot of variation with our group, and one of the things we should understand is some agencies view the decapitation method as the most appropriate approach. In other words, you go after leadership, you decapitate the snake, and then the rest of it dies. It'd be a fool's errand to do that to the Tongos. They don't have the leadership. It's functional leadership. It's not an organizational structure. And it's recognizing through the use of things like gang audits that before you do interventions, before you institute practices to stop gang activity, you need to do an audit of the landscape. And part of that audit needs to recognize that there is variation, not just in their sizes, not in their demographics, but in how they're structured. And how they're structured, there could be very different reactions to different suppression tactics based on it. We've seen some evidence in Chicago. The structured groups, they just replace their members, whereas the decentralized groups, they do have some problems associated with when there are suppression efforts targeted at them. The last 2 points to make here, and I'm going to wrap up, are that multiple methods for understanding gangs. That this isn't so much as an implication for policy, but it's more of an implication for the fact that you need to look at it from multiple different angles. We're not just saying that our survey is the be-all, end-all, but it's our survey in combination with law enforcement views, our survey in combination with different methods of looking at these groups. The good thing to say is that we're not talking past each other. We're talking about the same group of people. So that's one shred of evidence here that is a positive sign. And it is a promising approach to be able to learn about it. Last point to make here is about reentry. So gang members check off nearly all the boxes related to reentry. They don't get as much programming. Many of them are in solitary confinement. They have these social deficiencies that I talked about earlier. And so it indicates that they're almost set up to fail, or to at least have higher risks of recidivism. And they also have these obligations to the gang. And so as a consequence of that, they're going to have higher rates of recidivism. And there needs to be ways to respond to them and respond to them effectively. If you respond to them in prison, it could play dual dividends on the street. So let me wrap up with a nice picture of our mountains in Colorado. Here's some more contact information. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, very much.